The winter wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would blanket the territory in white for weeks to come. Jacob Thornton stood at the window of his log cabin, watching the sky darken to the color of gunmetal, his breath fogging the glass as he considered the work that still needed doing before the worst of it hit. He was 32 years old, and he had been alone on this ranch for nearly 7 years, ever since his father passed and his mother followed 6 months later, her heart simply giving out from grief. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of prairie land, with cattle that needed tending, horses that required breaking, and endless fences that demanded mending. Jacob had built a life here that was predictable and solitary, punctuated only by the changing seasons and the occasional trip into town for supplies. He spoke to his animals more than he spoke to people, and he had grown comfortable with the silence that filled his days. The loneliness had become like an old coat, worn and familiar, something he barely noticed anymore except on the coldest nights when the wind seemed to carry voices from his past. It was late afternoon when he heard the sound of horses approaching, their hooves crunching through the early snow that had begun to fall. Jacob grabbed his rifle from above the door, more from habit than fear, and stepped out onto the porch. What he saw made him lower the weapon immediately. 2 figures on horseback emerged through the swirling snow, one clearly a woman bundled in a heavy coat, the other smaller, a girl perhaps, clinging to her mother's waist as they rode double on a weary-looking mare. Behind them, a pack horse struggled through the deepening drifts, loaded with whatever possessions they had managed to salvage from wherever they had come. The woman pulled up her horse at the edge of his property, her face pale with cold and exhaustion. She was perhaps in her late 30s, with strands of dark hair escaping from beneath her wool hat, and eyes that held both determination and desperation. The girl behind her looked to be about 12 or 13, her face pressed against her mother's back, her own eyes wide with fear and cold. "Please," the woman called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "We've been riding for 3 days. The storm caught us unprepared. We need shelter, just for the night. We can pay you, or work for our keep. Please." Jacob studied them for a long moment, his instincts warring with his isolation. He had learned to be cautious in this territory, where strangers could bring trouble as easily as they brought company. But he saw no deception in the woman's face, only exhaustion and a mother's fierce protectiveness for her child. He nodded once and gestured toward the barn. "Get your horses inside," he called back. "I'll help you with your things. You can stay in the cabin." Relief washed over the woman's features so visibly that Jacob felt something tighten in his chest. He helped them dismount, noting how the girl's legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand. How long she must have been in that saddle. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, and her daughter as Sarah. They had been traveling from Denver, she explained as they led the horses into the barn, after her husband died from pneumonia. They were heading to her sister's place in Helena, but had underestimated both the distance and the severity of the approaching winter. Inside the barn, Jacob helped them unsaddle their horses and settle them with feed and water. The animals were in rough shape, but they would recover with rest and proper care. He noticed that Margaret moved with a quiet competence, clearly someone who knew her way around livestock, while Sarah helped where she could, her small hands working to unbuckle straps and carry saddle blankets despite her obvious exhaustion. When the horses were settled, Jacob led them to the cabin. It was a simple structure, built by his father's hands with local timber, solid and weatherproof but modest. Inside, there was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and 2 bedrooms that Jacob barely used anymore, preferring to sleep in the larger room near the fire. He quickly stoked the flames in both the fireplace and the stove, filling the space with warmth that made Sarah sigh audibly with relief. "You can use the bedroom there," Jacob said, pointing to the door on the left. "I'll sleep out here. There's a wash basin in the room, and I'll heat some water for you. When was the last time you ate?" Margaret's hesitation told him everything he needed to know. He set about preparing food, pulling out salt pork, beans, and the sourdough bread he had baked 2 days earlier. As he cooked, he was acutely aware of their presence in his space, the way it disrupted the careful patterns of his solitary life. Sarah sat at the table, her eyes following his every movement, while Margaret moved to help him, her hands quick and efficient as she sliced the bread and set the table with the mismatched plates and cups that Jacob had collected over the years. They ate in relative silence, the exhaustion of travel and the comfort of hot food making conversation difficult. But Jacob noticed things about them, the way Sarah would glance at her mother before taking seconds, seeking permission, the way Margaret's eyes constantly checked on her daughter, making sure she was warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. There was a bond between them that spoke of shared grief and survival, and Jacob felt something stir in him that he had thought long dormant, a recognition of what family meant, of what it felt like to care for someone beyond yourself. After dinner, Margaret insisted on cleaning up despite Jacob's protests, and Sarah helped, the two of them moving around his kitchen with a natural rhythm that transformed the space. For the first time in years, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a home. When the dishes were done, Sarah could barely keep her eyes open, and Margaret guided her to the bedroom, tucking her in with a tenderness that made Jacob turn away, suddenly feeling like an intruder on their intimacy. When Margaret returned to the main room, she found Jacob standing by the fire, staring into the flames. She stood beside him for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't know what we were going to do." The storm came on so fast, and Sarah was getting hypothermic. "You saved us." Jacob shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Not everyone. Trust me on that." They talked then, in low voices so as not to wake Sarah, and Jacob learned more about Margaret's journey. Her husband had been a good man, a clerk in Denver, who had caught pneumonia during an early cold snap and never recovered. They had lost their home when she couldn't keep up with the rent, and her sister in Helena was the only family she had left. Margaret had worked as a seamstress, a cook, and a laundress to scrape together enough money for the journey, and she had hoped to make it before winter set in. But the weather had turned early this year, and now she was trapped by circumstance and the approaching storm. "The storm should break in a few days," Jacob said, though he knew it might be longer. "You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel." Margaret's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. "We'll work for our keep. I'm good with cooking and mending, and Sarah's a hard worker despite her age. We won't be a burden." But Jacob found that he didn't mind their presence as much as he thought he would. Over the next few days, as the storm raged outside and buried the ranch under 3 feet of snow, a routine developed that felt almost natural. Margaret took over the cooking, transforming his simple provisions into meals that reminded Jacob of his mother's kitchen. She mended his clothes, darning socks and patching shirts that he had simply learned to live with in their worn state. Sarah helped with everything, from feeding the chickens in the sheltered coop to organizing his chaotic supply room, bringing a sense of order to his bachelor existence. But more than the practical help, they brought something else to the cabin, something Jacob hadn't realized he was missing. They brought laughter, the sound of Sarah giggling at one of her mother's stories, or the gentle teasing between mother and daughter as they worked together. They brought conversation, Margaret's thoughtful observations about life and survival, her questions about the ranch and the territory that made Jacob see his own life through fresh eyes. They brought warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth and everything to do with human connection. Jacob found himself teaching Sarah about the ranch, showing her how to card wool from the sheep he kept, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to read the weather in the color of the sky at dawn. She was an eager student, soaking up knowledge with an intensity that reminded him of himself at that age. Margaret would watch them sometimes, a soft expression on her face that made Jacob wonder what she was thinking. On the 4th night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Margaret and Jacob sat by the fire as had become their custom. The wind had finally died down outside, leaving behind a pristine landscape of snow that sparkled under the moonlight streaming through the window. "The storm's past," Margaret said quietly, and Jacob heard the unspoken question in her voice. "The main road won't be passable for at least another week," he replied. "Maybe 2. And your horses need more rest before they can handle that kind of journey." Margaret nodded, relief evident in her posture. Then she surprised him by speaking the thought he had been avoiding. "What if we didn't leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we stayed?" Jacob turned to look at her, his heart suddenly pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Sarah and I need a home, and you need help running this ranch. I'm saying that in the past 4 days, this place has felt more like home than anywhere I've lived in years. I'm saying that maybe we were meant to find you, Jacob Thornton, and maybe you were meant to find us." Jacob stared into the fire, his mind racing. He thought about the years of loneliness, the silence that had become his companion, the slow withering of his soul that he had accepted as the price of his isolation. And he thought about the past 4 days, the sound of voices in his cabin, the smell of proper cooking, the feel of purpose that came from protecting and providing for people he was coming to care for. "I'm not an easy man to live with," he said finally. "I'm set in my ways, and I've been alone too long. I don't know how to be around people anymore. I'm a widow with a child and nothing to my name but what's packed on that horse in your barn," Margaret replied. "I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I've survived things that should have broken me. But I know how to work, and I know how to build a life from nothing. And Sarah deserves better than constantly running from one place to another, never having a real home." They sat in silence for a long moment, and then Jacob spoke words that surprised even himself. "Stay then. Stay for the winter at least. We'll see how it goes. If it works, if we can make a life here together, then we'll make it permanent. I could use the help and the company. And Sarah, she deserves a place to call home." Margaret's hand found his in the darkness, and they sat together watching the fire burn down to embers, neither of them speaking but both understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their lives. The loneliness that Jacob had worn like a second skin was beginning to peel away, replaced by something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. Winter passed into spring, and spring into summer, and the arrangement that had begun as temporary became permanent without any formal declaration. Margaret and Sarah simply stayed, and Jacob simply let them, and somewhere in the quiet accumulation of shared days and common purpose, they became a family. Sarah called him Jacob at first, then Pa by the following winter, and Margaret became not just his partner in running the ranch but his partner in life, married quietly in town the next spring with Sarah standing as their witness. The ranch that had been a prison of solitude became a home filled with life. Jacob taught Sarah to ride like she was born in the saddle, and Margaret transformed the cabin with curtains and quilts and the 1,000 small touches that turned a house into a home. They worked the land together, building something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. And on the cold winter nights when the wind howled across the Montana plains, Jacob would sit by the fire with his family around him and marvel at how completely his life had changed. How 2 strangers riding through the snow had brought him back to himself, had reminded him that a life lived alone was only half a life, and that sometimes salvation comes when you least expect it. In the form of a desperate woman and her daughter asking for nothing more than shelter from the storm.